looking up at the ceiling, hysterically crying, thinking of how I was going to possibly self-soothe and put myself to sleep because everyone had always done it for me, not just drugs and alcohol, but my mom when I was little and my boyfriend, fiance, and now husband. And now he wasn't there either, right? So what was I going to do?
All right, y'all, I'm here with Sam. Let's jump in. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm really
Yeah,
excited.
I am too. Okay, you have a journey, a story, and I typically wait for the journeys and stories as we get the convo started, but I feel like we have to start there because that will lead us into all the other things. So, can you just tell us a bit about your journey to and through sobriety, all the things?
Yeah, it's a meaty story. If I were to encapsulate my growing up, it would be a young girl with an older sister and two parents who were very unhappily married, who all had their own battles with addiction, though, of course, this is me speaking from the vantage point of a grown woman. I did not know any of that at the time.
Sure.
I was just watching a mom pop prescription pills, whether she had a good day or a bad day, who believed that the world had hurt her so much that she could just go out and do whatever she wanted, no matter how reckless, and that she would tell her two young daughters all about it. So there were no boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
There was an overexposure to things like sex and drugs. My father's presence growing up was very emotionally absent. I used to say about him, never underestimate the power of denial. So on the one hand, he was a champion of my dreams, which as a young girl were to be an artist, a performing artist, singing and dancing all over the world. And my mom was terrified of the idea of that kind of unstable life because her whole life had been unstable.
Mm-hmm.
She really felt like getting a degree was a surefire way to having something in your hand that no one could take from you.
Yeah.
Of course, without teaching me that when you sign away on the dotted line for a bunch of student loans that actually end up costing you so much more than the money you'll make, that's not really stable, right? So again, it was sort of what they could do at the time. Our
Right.
parents basically do the best they can with the tools they have. And so my sister was exploring with sex and drugs and whether she liked boys or girls. And so I was just the youngest one and watching a lot of volatility, a lot of emotional explosion with my mother, who I now know suffered from mental illness as well, but I did not know that at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I was trying to keep the peace. So my role became do not ask questions. When your intuition shows up and asks those tough things like, Mommy, why are you taking those pills? And that shit gets shut down.
Mm-hmm.
You better stop asking and you better make sure everyone else is okay, especially mom. Because when she's okay, you're safe and loved and everything's fine in the world, right?
Yep.
And so I learned to self-abandon out of the gate. I learned that pleasing and performing and perfecting was a safety net as a child in a really unstable home. And so my dreams of the arts really went sort of to the wayside in exchange for pursuing academics, which was, a highly controlled environment. And as a
Mm-hmm.
type A, that felt really good. If I study X amount of times, I will most likely get the A, and the A means that I am loved and adored and smart enough and good enough, which of course I never felt enough of anyway, because most untreated perfectionists do not. So, I sort of bamboozled my way through high school and started college, ended up getting caught plagiarizing when I couldn't get an A for the first time in my
Mm-hmm.
life at a major university and got an 18-month suspension.
Mm-hmm.
Up until that point, I had dabbled with drugs and alcohol. I had experimented. Nothing ever stuck and became a wild and reckless habit. I was always worried about losing control. And so that moment in my life, again, only from hindsight can I speak to this, sparked such a serious amount of shame because I was now fully identified with my ability to be a straight A student. And here I
Mhm.
was, the first and only time in my life that I plagiarized, getting caught in the worst way. And now all my friends were going to go on and finish Boston University. And when I was allowed back, they would be second semester seniors, and I would be a first semester junior. And so it was just unfathomable to me that that happened. And I made a story up that I was going to go and pursue my dream to be
Mhm.
a star.
Mhm.
And for over a decade, I didn't say anything about why I actually left. It was just, I left school to pursue my dreams. That is when my drinking and drugging really picked up.
Mm.
Because after trying to live home with my mom, which, you grow up and your parents' word is God, gospel for
Mhm.
a time. And
Mhm.
then you get exposed and you start to individuate and you go, wait a second. And that really happened in Boston. I was like, what just happened in my house? What just happened? And why did she tell me the things she told me? And why did she expose me to the things she exposed me? And where has my father been? I was so angry. And here I was getting kicked out of university, which was, of course, my mother's worst nightmare. And I'm in a space of, well, I don't even know who you are. And now I'm telling you I want to pursue what I actually love, and you don't even support that. So the fighting was so bad that I was like, I'll just move to the city. I'll just do what artists do. I'll get a job bartending. I'll audition during the day and I'll make the cash at night, and I'll
Mhm.
eventually, it'll all take off. And really what took off was my cocaine addiction.
Mm.
As soon as I saw cocaine, and it's funny because people would talk about it like it was spectacular. And I
Mhm.
remember trying it and being like, I don't know what the big deal is. And so leave it to me to be like, well, I want to find out what the big deal is. It's supposed to be that good. So I did it until I understood sort of the feeling, especially the way it leveled me out after drinking maybe a little too much behind the bar.
Mhm.
And, if I fast forward this point in my life, because it was so difficult with no inner template for resilience, no connection to my inner knowing, to tolerate the rejection of the entertainment industry.
Mm.
So, of course, I went back to school to try to play it safe because it was just so ingrained, and it was a safe spot for me. So, I had gotten a degree in some broad major and considered, if I did get a really fancy degree, like what would feel right for my personality? Should I not become the next Britney Spears? And then getting a doctorate in physical therapy was like Dr. Hart. Oh my God. Like this would just make my mother so happy.
Mm.
And I could see myself fitting in somewhere. I loved the body. I loved movement. I loved exercise. You could start your own practice. You could work with athletes. It felt versatile enough where I could fit into it.
Mhm.
So if we fast track this time in Manhattan, on the day of my acceptance into my graduate program, overdosed on cocaine.
Mm.
That is the level at which I was
Mm.
operating at the same time, right?
Wow.
And I think that the second part of this is that that was not my bottom. And
Mm.
I think that's really important because it's still in 2024, addiction is wildly misunderstood, although we are learning a lot more and talking more about it. The science and the soulfulness of real change, in my experience, is such that you have to exhaust the patterns that you usually learned when you were a kid. In my case, survival patterns that kept me safe. You have to exhaust them to a point where going on the way you are is more scary and more painful than abandoning the patterns and trying something new.
Mhm.
By the time I overdosed, I was really scared that I was losing control of drugs and alcohol. But all the other patterns, I can probably figure this out.
Mhm.
It's not something I lose control over. Plus, I'm getting a doctorate. Plus, I have an apartment in New York City. Plus, I have a boyfriend. Plus, I have a good body. There was no evidence in the sea of what I had learned and had been baked into my nervous system, that I should have to stop or make a radical change in my life.
Right.
There wasn't, the scale had not tipped yet
Mm-hmm.
toward I'm totally done and desperate. It just hadn't. And I think what is required for change is a level of spiritual bankruptcy
Mm.
that no outside person, place, thing, or situation can
Mm-hmm.
press upon you.
Mm-hmm.
It just has to happen. And though I dabbled in recovery after that overdose, it was another year and a half before I went back to a meeting, because I still tried to cut and paste my using
Mm.
in ways that maybe wouldn't kill me as fast. And when I was caught, if you will, the person I was dating had sort of seen the ugliest sides of my addiction and was, besides myself, the person I hurt the most. He found this bottle of prescription pills that my father had been providing for me, because his role, while very emotionally passive, was the absolute untreated codependent. And so
Mm.
in order to stay in proximity to my mother and be in her good favor, if her meds ran out, he would get them in his name and give them to her. And then that rolled into driving into the city and giving them to me, and
Mm-hmm.
driving into New Jersey and giving them to my sister. And when you're in your addiction, there's nothing better than that.
Mm-hmm.
Your own dad, you can call him whenever you need him. And this guy I was dating found this bottle of pills and was like, "Are you fucking kidding me?
Mm-hmm.
You're still doing this shit."
Mm-hmm.
So I went back to a meeting, called the only person that I knew who I had ever met that was sober. And this time I was like, fuck, dude, I still wasn't ready. I was very scared the guy was going to leave me. But I really wasn't ready, especially when I heard the steps. I was like, oh God, like the patriarchy, this looks and feels like nothing that I can identify with. I mean, I othered myself to death, but in again, in hindsight, those steps in their traditional language butted up against everything I learned as a kid that kept me safe. If
Mm-hmm.
my mother's word was God, and by the way, there was no such thing as God, and the only person who believed in God was an idiot.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I learned.
Mm-hmm.
The only person you can count on is yourself. If that is true, and now a 12-step program is telling me, good luck, kid, because without a power greater than yourself, you're probably not going to stay sober.
Right.
Sorry, I'm good. Then
Mm.
this is not going to work. But this guy Bobby was like, just follow me. Just follow me. And I believed him. I believed nothing and no one, but I believed Bobby. And I followed Bobby around the city like a little puppy. Bobby had 22 years sober from heroin addiction, and he had this crazy life story. The things that he had survived, besides multiple overdoses, like he was 13 years old, opened the front door to the man who shot and killed his dad.
Oh my
And this
gosh.
guy was the Irish mob, right? And here he was, sober,
Right.
bright, beautiful, happy. So he took me through the steps quickly in a year's time, and I didn't believe in God, and he knew it. And he knew I was 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And he was like, "You're just going to borrow my faith until you have some of your own. It's all good."
Mm-hmm.
So I did, and I was in graduate school the whole while. And towards the end of my first year sober, I got a chance to come out to California. So living still in New York City, and Bobby started acting weird. Couldn't put my finger on it. And I was like, we were friends before you became my sponsor. He used to be a client of mine when I was a personal trainer.
Mm-hmm.
But let's go back to being friends. I don't know what's going on with you, but I'm just going to get a temporary sponsor in California. And I'll keep in touch. And when I get back, I'll see you. And then I didn't hear from him. And I kept calling and calling and calling. And finally his wife picked up and was like, he relapsed. That's why you haven't heard from him. Which, I mean, I knew nothing about addiction. I knew nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And it was unimaginable to me that that man could relapse.
Mhm.
Imagine, the only pillar of recovery that I trusted and believed. And now it just shattered.
Mhm.
I just thought, surely I will come home and I will find out the story from him. And maybe there's a really good explanation. And, let's just put a pin in this and it'll all make sense when I get back. And then I met up with him and I just remember feeling like I was in the presence of a ghost, not unlike as a little girl. I remember sitting on the landing of our staircase and I would watch my mom, who ate almost nothing all day because she also had an untreated eating disorder,
Mm.
high on her medication and shoveling sweets down her throat. And her eyes would be glazed over. And every now and again, she would see that I was there. And it was like the vacancy
Mhm.
was being in the presence of a ghost. And here I was again with Bobby, feeling the same way. Like someone went behind his eyes and just blew the light out.
Mm.
And he didn't admit that he relapsed. He couldn't look me in the eye.
Mm.
He had a ton of excuses. And I was so not just confused, frightened.
Mm.
He was unrecognizable. And I met up with him one more time after that and decided I need some space because this is too scary for me. And a couple of weeks later, a sober friend who had a lot more time than me, who took a liking to me, even though I was such a stompy, angry newcomer. I was not a person in recovery who was like, I'm so happy to be here. I did not have that, white light experience or
Mhm.
whatever. It was like everything was a trigger. I fucking hated it. It was so torturous. And she liked me and she said, where are you? I have to talk to you. And she ended up coming to my apartment, sitting me down and saying, Bobby is dead.
Mm.
So Bobby ended up jumping out of his 8th-story window onto
Oh
52nd Street.
my gosh.
So now, you know, I'm 1 year sober and my sponsor who saved my life, not just relapsed, but killed himself.
Mhm.
But what am I going to do now? Right. I knew in that moment that if I relapsed, I was dead. 100%. Because if it
Mhm.
killed Bobby, which
Yeah.
it's
Mm.
coming, and I didn't want to die, but I only knew how to live by controlling and managing and manipulating everyone and everything around me, like I learned when I was a girl.
Mhm.
And I hadn't bought in yet that I needed any kind of faith other than the faith in myself to curate the world I needed. So off I went for 4 more years with no higher power
Mm.
and no God and an empty program. And I remained physically abstinent, but I was spiritually dead inside, particularly when my marriage to the guy who I was dating when I was an active addict was falling apart.
Mm.
Because, we went straight through and got engaged and got married. And there were so many fractures in the relationship that needed to be healed way before we did those things. I was just so glad he didn't leave me, And then he pulled away. And I was like, oh, no, 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 no. Bobby's gone. We now live in California. I've left home. You're the only thing that I have, and you are not going to leave me. Because if you leave me, then I'm nothing and I'm no
Mhm.
one. I really felt that way. And when I tell you I went to every length imaginable to try to beg him to forgive me, I did, to the point of going insane. I mean, I literally went insane in recovery. And I ended up moving out a zillion times on a zillion people's couches until I finally signed a lease and got my own space. And that was rock bottom. 5 years sober, empty program, zero sense of self, no ability to tolerate uncertainty.
Mhm.
That period of 6 months was like a dark night of the soul. I was so depressed every day, but a woman came into my life who I heard speak at a meeting. She had killed somebody in her addiction. She was standing on this podium, happy.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought, I got to talk to this woman. Ended up being my sponsor. I had tried so many different sponsors, many of whom pressed God down my throat to the point that it made me want to puke and push against the program more. And she was so gentle and loving. And she was also in Al-Anon. She had a different angle. And she said, what if we work the steps on your marriage? I'm not saying you're not an addict, but I don't know that we need to say I'm powerless over alcohol and cocaine and my life is manageable. I think you know that. But what you don't know is you're powerless over your marriage and what your husband is or isn't doing, whether it's going to work out, whether you have no sense of self whatsoever without his love for you, which is now not there. And so when you try to exert power over his thoughts, his actions, his behaviors, the future of it, your life becomes unmanageable in the following ways. I mean, you have no access to peace, real power. Your self-worth is coming externally. So we just chipped away at the steps in this way. And only after making an amends to myself, which was the first time in my life, not just in recovery, that anyone even said, have you ever made an amends to yourself? Because I was a self-lacerator. I was a hard type A.
Yeah.
There was no such thing as compassionate self-talk. The reason why that act and beginning to arrest the inner critic, hearing her, identifying her, knowing that she's stepping in from an old place of survival, honoring her appearance and lovingly saying, I know why you're here, but this never ends well. And I'm going to need you to just move over to a different seat at the boardroom table. And I'm going to try to find a more loving way to say to myself what you just tried to say to me. Right? So there was this practice of compassionate self-talk, and it is a practice.
Yeah.
But as I began, I could actually start to hear the whisper of my intuition, which, honest to God, the last time I remembered hearing was when I was 4, and I said, why do you have to take those pills every night, mommy? And when that got shut down, she went away. She went into a dark corner to hide. I literally hadn't heard her voice in over 2 decades until that moment. When I was on the mattress in this apartment, looking up at the ceiling, hysterically crying, thinking of how I was going to possibly self-soothe and put myself to sleep, because everyone had always done it for me, not just drugs and alcohol, but my mom when I was little, and my boyfriend, fiance, and now husband. And now he wasn't there either, right? So what was I going to do? And instead of my critical voice showing up, which always was very, very loud, sort of like a wild ping pong game between my ears, so cerebral, so constrictive and anxiety producing. It was like a bubble that sort of gently rises up to the surface. My intuitive voice was she just showed up and was very expansive, very calm, very curious. She said, what if you put your arms around yourself and held yourself to sleep? Which at the time I thought was ridiculous and really scary. But I was shit out of options. So I did it. And so in that sacred space, though I was more frightened really than ever every day, going into my job and just existing, I was so fragile. I was also becoming a woman who was learning how to be in deep communion with her knowing which is now my superpower, which is now the God of my understanding. So it's such a hard, long question, but it's been 10 years since then. There's a lot that's happened,
Yeah.
15 years sober, but
Yeah.
that is really everything that shaped my recovery. And I don't like to say that everything happens for a reason, because I feel like that would mean that Bobby died so that I could live. And that sounds really lovely and poetic, but I do believe that death has a way of giving us permission to learn how to live more fully.
For sure. Yeah.
So it certainly did that.
Yeah, for sure. What do you think, what was it for you? What was the exact, so the 12 steps, you were saying it was kind of like this empty experience for you, like the program. What was it that shifted, I guess? And you mentioned the kind of how the woman was helping, but what do you think was the kind of that pivotal, or maybe it was just kind of the catalyst that it finally did work for you? Like the way the 12 steps were, it was like, this isn't working for me. What was it that actually made it stick? I'm using air quotes here, but you know what I mean?
Yeah. A couple things. I think I was finally in a position, like I said earlier, where I was primed for change, which I had literally exhausted
Everything.
every pattern.
Yeah.
And staying in that space was scarier than trying the steps around my marriage. So even though I was scared to really look at what was happening in my marriage and get rigorously honest about that, the way I felt was way scarier.
Yeah.
So I made the jump and I took her suggestion.
Yeah.
However, if her suggestion had been the traditional route of the steps, I don't know what would have happened.
Right.
So suddenly the language of the steps in every single one of them becoming custom fit, precise crisis that I was in was so useful.
Right.
Because now at any moment of the day, when I felt anxious or terrified or afraid, I could draw from any one of them and actually use them as a tool to get to the other side of the emotion that was right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does that answer that
Yeah,
question?
no, it's a good answer. No, that makes total sense. I think, what do you think? I mean, you've been through this yourself. You've seen it because you've been in recovery programs, all that. So you mentioned the point for you, like the overdose thing wasn't like, that wasn't the rock bottom. And you hear stories about that a lot. Like you said, that, people in your recovery program, it's like they have survived multiple overdose, all that. So you said for you, it was this like feeling of spiritual bankruptcy. So what do you see? Because I feel like that happens a lot, right? It's like how many, I have a friend of mine, her brother suffers from addiction, and she's like you're about to use all your lives. Like the 9 lives are about up. Like, I don't know how many more times. What do you see as, and maybe you just answered it just then, but for like the physical rock bottom isn't what always, I'd say maybe most of the time, isn't what makes people, propels them in the right direction to, recover. So it's that spiritual piece that has to land. Like, what do you see? How do we, what am I trying to ask you? Like, how do we get to the point where it doesn't require people to get this spiritual rock bottom and they have to hit these physical things multiple times before they're finally like, oh, okay, now, like, what do you think is the piece there that's missing? Is it something in the recovery program? Is it something?
Well, I mean, a lot of people, it's impossible to know.
Yeah.
That's the thing, right? It's so impossible to know. I mean, if culturally we weren't so rewarded for everything outside of us, if in my house growing up, I wasn't so rewarded for my straight A's and all my anxiety leading up to having to perform perfectly wasn't overlooked and missed.
Mm-hmm.
I have had parents who gave me a way to gut check things along the way. If when I had been introduced to the 12 steps, they had been modern and trauma informed and back
Mm-hmm.
what we now know about addiction and childhood trauma and psychology. If,
Right.
maybe,
Right.
maybe it wouldn't have had to be so dire, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe more addicts wouldn't die before
Mm-hmm.
they hit their real bottom. I lost my sister 2 years ago to a
Mm-hmm.
drug overdose.
Oh man.
I was that person that your friend is,
Right.
on the phone with her multiple times. You are going to die.
Mm-hmm.
You don't stop.
Mm-hmm.
She has 2 kids. She left them behind.
Oh man.
It leading by example wasn't enough.
Right. Right.
Begging and pleading and convincing and showing her there is a different way to look at these steps. It wasn't enough.
Mm-hmm.
Showing her that I could see our very fucked up parents in a loving and compassionate way, that
Mm-hmm.
they were doing the best they could with the tools that they had, though they were very limited,
Right.
wasn't enough. Her children weren't enough. What would have been enough? I don't know. I just know that if I reduce down, in my opinion, not just with my sister and addicts who are killing themselves, but with culture at large, if I reduce down what I think is the number one killer, spiritually first in our lives, and physically, if it gets severe enough,
Mm-hmm.
it's untreated shame.
Mm-hmm.
My book that is out in the world right now is called Breaking the Circuit. And it is a modern reinvention of the 12 steps,
Mm-hmm.
because that's ultimately what saved my life. But in the doing of the steps, forgiving myself, which is not a baseline approach to the 9th step, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? There is walking into a 12-step program who does not have some level of shame,
Sure.
period, that
Yep.
probably started so early on in
Oh
their
yeah.
lives.
Oh
They
yeah.
are,
Yep.
okay? Some level of not enoughness.
Yep.
Why are we not taught that the first person we need to forgive and practice forgiving is ourselves?
Mm-hmm.
Until I did that, forget about hearing my intuition, which
Mm-hmm.
was, until I did that, I was living in a marriage that was horrible for me.
Mm-hmm.
I thought I deserved it.
Right. Right. I brought this on myself.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, in my attempt to do something with my grief, something with the collective suffering we are facing, something with the fact that every single one of us is drowning in a sea of despair, before we go and do something about changing our lives, I wrote a book to try and make this toolkit current and
Mm-hmm.
accessible to anybody, whether they're an addict or not,
Mm-hmm.
as an arsenal for shame resilience,
Mm.
which I believe is at the very epicenter
Yeah.
of
Mm-hmm.
addiction
Mm-hmm.
and depression and
Yeah.
anxiety.
Yeah. I was just about to say, I would say it goes even past addiction. I talk about this all the time. And, I use a lot of energetics and stuff in my work, but a lot of the women I work with have severe hormonal issues, reproductive issues. We talk about shame and the sacral center and all like there's all these things tied, but I am 100% on board with this because I feel like, I mean, and I think as women especially, like again, if I don't know if you believe in, generational trauma, past lives, all that stuff, but like we are born with generations of shame in our DNA, like literally in our cells when we're born. Just from like you mentioned the patriarchy earlier. I mean, there's so many things that it's so I I am fully on board with this theory that you have because I feel like, and I feel like you said, we're first of all, we're never taught about shame really. And then if we're not taught about it, we're obviously not taught how to deal with it and manage it. And then it manifests, like you said, it's addiction, of course, but then there's depression, anxiety. There's all sorts of other, I think a lot of mental illness has its roots in this,
A lot
reproductive
of
things. Like,
autoimmune
yep,
diseases
exactly.
also that
100%.
mostly women suffer from.
Exactly. Exactly.
Statistically.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
So my work in the world now, once upon a time, I did get that doctorate and I had a clinic in Santa Monica, cash based, and loved what I did. But after losing my sister, I needed to go into a cave and grieve and
Mm,
heal and create. And I
yep.
also knew that that version of me was dead too.
Yeah.
Whoever I was going to be on the other side of the grief, I didn't know yet, but she was going to be different and she was going to need to bring all of herself to different places and spaces if
Hmm.
my work in the world was going to feel meaningful. So I became certified as a life coach. My book is a bestseller. And when I work with somebody now, it is a full stop, comprehensive mind, body, spirit
Yeah.
container
Yeah.
where the entire nervous system is going to get scanned, physical and emotional, and we're going to see where you're actually at. And we are going to create a week by week framework that is backed by science that also fuses the soulfulness
Hmm.
of your lived experience. And you are going to have a radical transformation on the other side. I am
Hmm.
not interested in just doing one or the other anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. You can't. I mean, you can't. I, we talk about this a lot on the show because, being a holistic practitioner, you can't. And I think that's, back to your point about, addiction and things being, there's a lot of misconceptions and all this. I also think this is the other part that, again, I'm no expert in addiction by any means, but I feel like this is another piece that could be missing from traditional 12-step program or whatever, is like, I mean, even just your example about like me forgiving myself, like, why is that not the first thing we're talking about? Like having this holistic approach, there's no other way to do it. I think we are so past the days of us under like thinking that we can compartmentalize ourselves as we're a body, and like it's all one. We can't say the body is not with the mind, mind's not with the body. So I think you have to address it holistically or it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's huge. I think that's huge. And I think that there's another lens because I want to ask you this too, because I just wanted to hear your thoughts on it. Because I think there's another lens that we can look at addiction through from this perspective. What do you see as some of the biggest misconceptions? Because you mentioned that, and I wanted to ask you that. The biggest misconceptions about addiction.
First of all, that we have a choice.
Mm,
If we talk about the science of addiction, once you're actively using for a period of time, and you don't become an addict unless you're perpetually
right.
feeding your reward centers, what actually happens is the feedback loops to the prefrontal cortex, which is our center for logic and reason, weaken.
Mm,
And the feedback loops for our reward centers, where we get our dopamine hit, strengthen. So you are literally, scientifically, less able to make rational choices. So even if
mm,
you wake up the next day from a horrible bender saying, I will never do this again, the reward pathways are so strong that you will find yourself drunk or high again later that day.
mm,
So that's one thing. And it's a real spiritual bypass at this point in 2024 to stand there and say, ugh, what are they doing?
right. Just
They could just
decide.
choose better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's misinformed, misunderstood, it's ignorant, and at its worst, it's a pass on vulnerability
Yeah.
and having to actually imagine that at one point this stuff was a solution to a real problem of
Mm-hmm.
being in so much pain,
Mm-hmm.
physical and emotional, potentially, right? But
Sure.
even it's just emotional.
Yeah.
This stuff solved your problem so well that you
Right.
could function.
Right.
And now the solution has become the problem,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
So really spinning that on its head and going, oh my God, like this was there for very good reason.
Mhm.
And now it's accelerated so badly. We get very caught in the wreckage part and in the inconvenience it places on our lives and on the ways it makes us look inward or not
Mhm.
at our own bad choices, that it's so much easier, and I remember hearing on a podcast, I don't remember which one, this beautiful quote that says, I think it was a podcast talking about grief. And I so related to, after losing my sister, the amount of times people said, I can't imagine how that must feel.
Mhm.
I can't imagine
Mhm.
how painful it was when people said that. And it reminds me of addiction in this way that we just don't want to look at it.
Right.
It's so painful to look.
Right.
And in the podcast, they said, imagination is the bridge to empathy.
Mm.
And I just thought, oh my God,
Wow.
what would this world look like
Mm.
if just for a second we dropped the armor around our heart such that we imagined
We do
what
imagine.
it
Yeah.
might feel like to be
Mhm.
carrying the pain of this other person,
Mhm.
and then to speak to them from that place
Yep.
of having imagined.
Yep.
What will come out of our mouth?
Mhm.
What kind of compassion or curiosity versus
Right.
can't imagine,
Right.
or oh, look at that fucking addict.
Right.
We get it.
Right.
We
Yep.
are really missing imagination and compassion and empathy around all of this.
Yeah. I love that. I love that perspective because we don't want to have to hold other people's stuff to be able to have the empathy or whatever. Like, and I also think that because, like, just on the same topic of just like emotional intelligence, I think sometimes too people think that in order to do that, then they have to have a solution, where it's like, no, sometimes people just need you to be there with them, like just to be with them, like to hold a little bit of that with them. And it's not about coming up with a solution in the moment, but can you just be there? And I think that people don't, I don't know, I think people just don't have the emotional intelligence or maybe the resiliency to be able to do that and just be there to hold and not have to like find a solution right then and there, you know?
And the people who do want to find a solution, like I can relate to that. I mean, the
Sure.
way I was raised was to fix
Of
fix it all.
course. Of course. Right.
That's somebody's own stuff getting activated,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And another reason to not go there.
Exactly.
You
Exactly.
might not even know that about
Right.
themselves, right? But
Right.
it's, yeah, no, it's not your job
Mm-hmm.
to save or manage or come up with and the person who's grieving doesn't 99.9% of the time doesn't want that anyway.
Right. Right. For sure. Mhm.
Just want to feel seen.
Yep.
And
Yep.
that's
Yeah. Well, and it's just like the feeling the emotions part. That's when we're bypassing emotions. That's all the emotions want too. Like if we can, like the shame, we're talking about the shame. We can get to a point where we can, like it just wants to be seen rather than us suppressing, pushing it back, or using other things to mask it or cover it up. Like it just wants to be seen and felt. Yeah. That's huge. I love this conversation. And I do think that it's your perspective on this is such I don't know, I just feel like there's a shift, there's a perspective shift that so many of us need, and probably the whole world of recovery probably needs from this the lens that you're looking at it through this. You've used the word trauma informed, like from a trauma informed lens, from this holistic lens. I think that this is something that's missing and could really save a lot of people. I mean, yeah, I do.
it's funny. I've really had to, in the wake of writing the book and it being out in the world now, ask myself, is this my latest attempt at trying to fix and save
Mm. Mm-hmm.
this book, and wanting it so badly to land in the laps of people who are suffering before they die from
Yeah.
their
Yeah.
pain. And the truth is, maybe it is, maybe it is. But I also know that I had been a living, breathing embodiment of using these steps in my life through hell and high water
Mm-hmm.
while my sister was alive. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't have the book yet, but I was living proof. And it didn't save her life.
Right.
So I don't know who this book will help. All I know is that this is what saved my life. And
Mm-hmm.
I am going to spend the rest of my life, because I don't know what else to do with the pain
Mm-hmm.
besides speak my hardest things out loud, not anonymously and just in the rooms of recovery,
Right.
but loud to a world that is in a state of global suffering,
Mm-hmm.
and say, these were my hardest things. This is how I got through them. Sometimes for better and sometimes for worse, but I'm here
Yeah.
because I am giving other people permission to be less ashamed to
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah. For
And
sure.
if that makes a dent in the trajectory of their lives
Mm-hmm.
towards something that is more joyful, then I have done a good job.
100%. Yeah, for sure. For sure. This is such a good conversation. And I do have one more question I ask that I ask everybody before we wrap up. But you've been talking about your book. Can you let everybody know where they can learn more about you, the work you do, and this really incredible book that you have?
Thank you. Yeah. So if the listeners go to my website, you'll really see all the spokes on the wheel that is me and my brand. So that would be Dr., which is just Dr. SamanthaHarte.com, and Harte is Harte. And that's also my social media handle. And I'm always posting content about this new version of the steps, something
Mhm.
that's meaningful
Yeah.
and impactful, that cuts through a lot of the bullshit
Yeah.
that we're seeing and hearing on social media.
Yeah.
But Amazon is a great place to find my book.
Perfect.
Order it on my website as well, but you just go to Amazon and type in Breaking the Circuit. I would say, right now, of course, when people get their hands on the book, it's such a financially economical way to access
Yeah.
something really life-changing.
Yeah.
I absolutely love coaching people one-on-one. So I have an entire coaching container, and people can find out about that on my website. And then I love speaking on stages. So one of the big missions I'm on right now is to become a very successful, well-known public speaker,
Mhm.
to bring all of this
Yeah.
to masses.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I love
I've
that.
started my own speaking event in LA called Heart Conscious Creator.
Awesome. That's amazing.
And I go on podcasts all the time. And,
Yeah.
I go anywhere I can, whether it's free or paid, to
Yeah. Get the
share.
word out. Yeah. I love that. Of course, I'll have links to all that in the show notes, so you can go check that out and check out everything that she's doing in the book and all the things. The last question I want to ask you is that I like to ask everyone, what do you think is the most important thing you can do to live with purpose?
Well, if you can have a way to clear shame so that you can hear your intuition, and then you follow the sound of her voice,
Hmm.
you will charge quickly or slowly towards the direction of your destiny.
Hmm. I love that. That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you so much, Sam. This was such an important conversation, and I am just grateful for you and sharing your message and getting it, like you said, getting in front of the masses and spreading your word and your message, because even if you only save one person, which, let's be honest, your reach is much bigger than that, but even if you save one person, that's one person you've saved with this work, and it's amazing work that you're doing. So thank you, and thank you for your time and sharing all that with us.
Thank you.